Today we're going to discuss qualitative research methods and what that means. In social science research, we've got two types of data that we normally collect. One would be quantitative, which you're pretty familiar with by now. A lot of numbers, anything you can put into a spreadsheet, things we can analyze statistically. When we're concerned with counting, then that would be quantitative data. However, the other side of the coin would be qualitative data, and how important that is in getting the bigger picture of a research project. Now, we say there are four major qualitative designs when it comes to social science research, and we're going to talk about these today. Some common features we see in qualitative research is most of the data comes in qualitative narratives. Now that means we're talking about words rather than numbers. We want to ask people about their experiences. Qualitative research is exploratory in nature, and we say it's conducted or committed to inductive reasoning. Now that means we want to collect information and then be able to say, oh, okay, well, from this information, this is what's happening. We don't test hypotheses in qualitative research like we do in quantitative research. Qualitative research is really set up to find out some of the more intricate parts of an issue, what's really going on, and asking people about their experiences, their feelings, and to really put in words some of that in-depth information that numbers simply cannot capture. Qualitative research designs are well suited when we're looking at expanding our understanding of an area and asking people to assign meaning to their experiences, their beliefs, answering the big how and why questions, and not just answering the what question. We say a lot of what we get in qualitative data are themes. Okay, so if we interview 10 people, 5 or 6 of them might mention the exact same thing. And therefore we could go, wow, based on the interviews that we've conducted, the majority of people say this. This is a theme in this research. Now what's cool about qualitative research is that we as researchers really can pay attention to social context. We can look at how social phenomena are interconnected, and that is something that's lost when we rely on numbers or quantitative research only. Now, qualitative methods can focus on events leading up to a particular outcome instead of just looking at causal explanations. So we can look at when something happens from A to Z. Looking at scripts. So when a person commits a crime, what are all the decisions that person goes through, from beginning to think about it, having a motivation, putting a plan together, instituting that plan, and taking the actions. So that would be looking at an entire process. Numbers can't capture that. So we can really capture what we call dynamic social processes by using qualitative methodology. We can also look at events embedded in time and consequences from certain events that cannot simply be a yes or no, or a 1 or a 0, and that we need more context around, which is why we sort of rely on this narrative or these words as our data. We also say we can use what's called a reflexive research design, and that means I might begin a study in a certain way, but depending on the data that I'm getting, how the study progresses can change. So the researcher might say, wow, I was initially thinking this, but the data I'm getting says this, so I think I'm going to shift my focus and start asking more questions around this. And what's cool is that the research really takes a big part in qualitative research design, and we can be very sensitive to the data that we're getting and respond to it and see if it's meeting the needs of our research question. All right, one type of qualitative design that's really commonly used is called field research. And we might call this field observation. Now, when we're talking in research terminology, observation is going to mean taking data, okay? So observing and recording data, that would be observations. Now, most research designs, a lot of them are designed to produce quantitative analyses, counting, coding particular things, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy do you feel today? These are so we can analyze things statistically, and we can, like we talked about, establishing causal inference, establish correlation, and run other statistical tests to see how variables are related numerically. Although qualitative research doesn't depend on how things are related numerically. Now, field research is when we get qualitative data. So this is when we talk to people, and this is when we can ask the questions that we really want answers to. If you're studying why people break into certain premises over others, why not ask them? You know, those are the experts on the topic. So if a researcher can sit down with several people who have been convicted of burglary, we can learn a lot just by asking questions, all right? Now, we say that it's not hypothesis testing. That's really kind of reserved for our quantitative methodology, but we can say this is a theory or a hypothesis generating process using qualitative research or field research. We can't predict what we're going to get. Again, like I said, it's very exploratory in nature, so sometimes we don't always know what we're looking for. So based on the information we do get, then we can start forming a theory, and then we can start generating hypotheses. Now, sometimes we call that grounded theory. We don't have a theory going in, but based on the data that we get, I can now make a theory. One popular methodology that we use are qualitative interviews. Now, interviews are a very common data collection technique. And survey interviews are one thing where a researcher would sit down with a subject and sit down with a clipboard or a computer and ask them questions and put their responses into coded answers. However, qualitative interviewing is very much about letting your subject talk or respond to what you're saying. We might have a list of topics to discuss rather than standardized questions with coded responses. Now, what's important about this is that it lets the participants set the tone, and it lets the participants tell the researcher what's important. This is very appropriate when we don't have a whole lot of knowledge about a topic. Again, this is where exploratory research can be well served by using qualitative designs. Now, one strength of this is flexibility. The answers that you get from your initial questions should shape your subsequent questions. So if you're asking about why someone did a particular thing, the answers that you get could now start ticking along, and you can ask follow-up questions to go into more detail based on that person's answer. In qualitative interviewing, it's not enough to simply ask pre-established questions. Another technique we can use are focus groups. Now, some of you may have participated in focus groups in the past, so you know what I'm talking about. You might see them on TV, where you've got several people sitting around a table or sitting in a room, and people are interviewed in a group setting, all right? The researcher could use open-ended questions and ask about particular products. We use focus groups all the time in consumer and market research. So, oh, how do you like our cereal? How do you like the packaging on here? What does that make you feel? In research, most focus groups involve about 7 to 10 people. So the fewer you have, the less people are going to want to talk. The more you have, 1 or 2 people could take over the responses. So 7 to 10 seems to be the most efficient group size. Now, although participants usually don't know each other, they're chosen so that they're relatively homogeneous. Now, that means when we're thinking about background or control variables, we want to make sure that there aren't too many big differences so that when people are comfortable with other people in the room, They can reduce their inhibitions, okay, and say what they really mean or what they really feel. Again, think about race as a factor here. Now, why would we use observation? Now, in this setting, I'm talking about observation as in going out into the field and observing with your own eyes something that's happening in action, okay? Now, we could capture a natural social context or human interaction as it happens. No story is complete without knowing how things happen. Think about David Attenborough, the king of animal documentaries. So he goes out with a lot of cameras and films what's happening in nature and comments on it. We can do the same about human behavior. We can go out and watch how people interact, especially around particular social settings. Good example at the moment would be in America, looking at protesters, protesting police mistreatment of citizens, protesting in support of Black Lives Matter, protesting the current presidential administration. So researchers could go out and say, well, how do protesters act? Do they use violence? Do they use words? Do they carry posters? How do they interact with people from different sides? At what point does violence break out? Now, the reason that we could go in the field and actually observe what happens is so we can provide more detailed descriptions of events or phenomena that can't be acquired in other ways, okay? Asking a survey about a protest is definitely not going to capture the entire social context, but being there and witnessing it with your own eyes can do that. Now, we can also use observation when we think about if we don't know a whole lot about a particular phenomenon, we can get a more richer understanding or a more thick description of what's happening. For instance, my PhD research, I looked at a specialty court. So I went to court every week and I sat in the jury box. It wasn't being used for a jury, but I observed what went on in court. I got the feel. I knew what the court processes were. I saw how people interacted with each other. And that really helped to build a story of how this court operates. Now, of course, observation can be combined with other techniques, and we can call that mixed methodology. Now, when a researcher goes into the field, there are 4 different roles that we can adapt. We can be a participant or an observer, and we can adapt a covert role or an overt role. Covert would mean that nobody in the research group knows that the researcher is studying. They think that the person is there, and we can consider this undercover. So you're kind of going undercover within a research group or disguising the fact that you're doing research. Now, on the other hand, if we are an overt researcher, participant or observer, this means that it's well known that you're here as a researcher in a research capacity, and the people that you're observing know this. Now, what role the researcher takes in field research depends on the question we want to answer. Could the researcher be a participant? Now, this means that we could participate in everyday normal activities of the population. This would allow us to develop a sustained and intensive relationship with people in the research group. So if you're looking at protesters, you might want to hang out with a group of protesters every day, see how these decisions are made, attend the protests that they go to, and you would become what's called an overt participant. So you're there, you're participating in the acts, and this is how you're gathering data. So you're included in the community or in the group that you're researching. However, there are some real ethical decisions that have to be made here. For instance, a colleague of mine did some research on drug dealers, and he did lots of interviews and lots of observation. However, he didn't really want to participate in the dealing of drugs or the consumption of drugs. So there's kind of a fine line that researchers have to balance when we consider, do we want to be participants or not in the research? Now, as an observer, on the other hand, we try to observe things as they happen without actively committing or disrupting these events. So again, think David Attenborough. So sitting on the outside and watching what's going on. Now, this is commonly used when we think about events and behaviors that occur in public. It would be very difficult to strictly be an observer at an event like a footy game, where you're part of the crowd and you're participating in watching the game and watching the behaviors around you. You can be an observer and sit on the outside. Imagine a researcher sitting with a clipboard on the outside and taking notes and strictly observing, okay? However, this can make people change their behavior if they know they're being observed. So we can consider advantages and disadvantages here. If we're doing a complete observation, okay, so no participation at all, the advantages are researchers can refuse to participate in illegal, unethical, or dangerous activities without fear of exposing their identity. Okay, so completely observing a phenomenon, we don't actually have to go out and harvest ivory for the illegal ivory trade if that's what we're researching. If we're an observer only, some of the ethical decisions, then we don't have to worry about so much. However, the disadvantages here of being a complete observer are people react. Now we have what's called the Hawthorne effect, based on a study done back in the 1920s, I believe, that says people react because they know they're being watched. Their behavior changes only because they know someone is watching. Now, what if researchers view illegal activity? What if they watch people commit crimes? Do we have an ethical dilemma here? So again, field research is a minefield of ethical issues that you have to navigate as a researcher. Now, advantages of participation. Now, obviously, researchers can decline to participate in any unethical or dangerous activities that you're doing research on. But because group members know that researchers are in the group, they can choose to keep some information hidden. So you might not get all of the information you're going for if it's known that you're there collecting data. Now, one disadvantage is researchers may have to prove themselves to a group by joining some of their questionable activities. There's a book written by a sociologist at the University of Chicago named Sudhir Venkatesh, where he joined a gang. Not literally joined a gang, but hung out with gang members on the south side of Chicago and researched how they made decisions, became very close with the leader of the gang, and watched as they did some criminal activity. So again, do we have an ethical dilemma as a researcher in the field? And the answer is always, it's possible. Now, what if we go undercover? Are there advantages to doing this? Well, yes. If someone doesn't know that you're a researcher, we don't have the Hawthorne effect happening. There are no reactive effects, okay? So participants don't know they're being observed. It's more likely they'll act in the behavior that they always act in. We can also gain entry to otherwise inaccessible settings if we don't say, oh, and by the way, I'm a researcher. People will let you in, whereas they might have not let you in if they knew you were going to research and take data. Now, disadvantages are quite big here. It's very difficult to play a covert role successfully. We're not actors as researchers. We are scientists, and we're there to find out information. We can't openly take notes. We can't record conversations, so we have to rely on our memories as our data collection tools. And we know that memories are fallible, all right? We also can't anticipate the unintended consequences of the researchers on the subject. And it could also lead to some distrust for social science researchers. So we're going to discuss a study from Laud Humphreys called The Tea Room Trade, when a researcher did exactly this. So he basically fooled his subjects, and that created a lot of distrust in the community. Now, it's very difficult to receive ethics approval if you're a researcher going strictly undercover. And in future lectures, we'll talk about ethics and what role that plays when we consider doing field research. Now, let me give you an example of a couple of studies that have used observation or field research. So we're observing what's happening in the real world. There was a study conducted in the 80s of institutional vandalism. So Graham and his research assistants would go out and walk in a neighborhood and count the number of broken windows and other signs of disorder, not just broken windows, twice a day. So by observing physical surroundings, that's still qualitative data, that's still field research, and they're recording what they're seeing. So it's really building a picture of vandalism as it's happening. 1984, Buckle and Farrington did a study looking at shoplifting in a small department store. And as researchers, they randomly selected a shopper and followed them around. I'm not sure if we could get away with doing this today, but the researchers would walk around and look at shoplifting behavior. So following a person, noting whether they're seeming like they're going to shoplift. Are they doing furtive measures? Are they trying to put things inside their bag or inside their clothing? Again, I'm not sure we could get away with this today. And finally, a more recent study used CCTV to observe shoppers in a mall type setting, a department store type setting. So instead of following somebody around, we used CCTV to look at what was happening, so observing what was happening in real time, and then recording our observations from there. There's a YouTube link on these slides that you're free to check that out. Now, what about an example of a researcher as a participant? Well, one of the most famous studies was looking at a group of young boys, sort of the beginnings of youth gangs in America in the 1940s. A researcher named William White took an overt participant observer. So basically, he was a researcher and went out into New York City and found a group of boys who he called them street corner boys, and they hung out in a particular neighborhood. They didn't particularly have jobs. Nobody had telephones or internet back in the day, so they would hang out in a real social setting. And he knew one person who let him gain entry into the group, or what we call sponsored him into the group. So this was an Italian neighborhood, what he called a slum back in the day, and he looked at their organization, this gang of boys, and how they were organized, what sorts of decisions they made, what sorts of activities they engaged in. And again, this was very progressive study for the 1940s. Now, one quote from his study said, "Sometimes I wondered whether just hanging on the street corner was active enough process to be dignified by the term research. Perhaps I should be asking these men questions. However, one has to learn when to ask questions and when not to question, as well as what questions to ask." So it's not just something you can learn and go out and perform. Qualitative or field research is sort of an art as well. Now, what about sampling when it comes to doing field research or qualitative research? Observational studies tend to use non-probability methods. Probability methods are not suited for qualitative research. Most of the time we're talking about hidden or very small populations, so therefore we want to rely on quality of data and not the number in our sample size. We can use snowball or quota sampling techniques. We can also use theoretical sampling. So we want to find a subject who has a story or who fits into the mold of the phenomenon that we're looking for. And we want to find similar subjects who can meet that criteria as well. Here's an example of theoretical sampling. There was an observational study of cocaine users. From observations, people become aware that some are employed individuals involved in cocaine. Then the researcher adds a new observation site to ensure employed individuals are included as well. So not just people who live on the street. So qualitative research is interesting. It's varied in how we can collect data, and it's not theory driven, it's theory producing or hypothesis generating. And it can help tell a story instead of just gathering numbers. And that's one of the strengths of qualitative data.